Imagine, imagine you are a detective, but you haven't just been handed some standard assignment. You've been handed a 2,000-year-old cold case.
Oh, the ultimate cold case.
Exactly. It surrounds an event that fundamentally shaped the entire course of human history. Yet it remains the subject of just intense, passionate debate even today. So welcome to the deep dive.
Glad you're here with us.
Today we are unpacking a highly specific text. We're looking at excerpts from authors Norman Geisler and Frank Turek, who they meticulously lay out an argument for the historical reality of the resurrection of Jesus. And it's just a fascinating read, regardless of where you stand on the subject, simply because of how methodically they attempt to build this case from the ground up.
Right. But before we dive into the actual evidence they present, we really need to establish a clear boundary for our discussion today.
Yeah, ground rules are important here.
Very important. Our mission today is to act purely as your guides through the specific source material. We are not taking sides, we're not endorsing these religious claims as absolute truth, and we're certainly not pushing any kind of theological agenda.
Definitely not.
Instead, we are impartially reporting on the arguments, the historical evidence, and the logical deductions exactly as they are presented by Geisler and Turek. Think of us as your research team. We're going to lay out their framework piece by piece so you can evaluate the architecture of their argument for yourself.
That is a crucial boundary to set. So, keeping that impartial lens, where do the authors actually start their argument? Our journey today is going to unfold in 3 stages.
Right.
First, we'll look at the historical baseline, what modern scholars actually agree on. Second, we'll open up the skeptic's toolkit and see how Geisler and Turek attempt to dismantle the most common alternative theories. And finally, we will explore the philosophy of miracles. Asking why people can look at the exact same set of historical data and walk away with completely different conclusions.
And the most logical place to start is with that historical baseline. The authors bring up a data point that often really surprises people, especially those who assume the academic community is just completely fractured on this topic.
Right, the Habermas study.
Yes, they highlight a massive research project conducted by a scholar named Gary Habermas.
And Habermas essentially did a meta-analysis. For those unfamiliar with the term, a meta-analysis is basically a giant study of other studies. He spent years collecting and analyzing over 1,400 critical scholarly works written on the resurrection.
And that was between 1975 and 2003, right?
Exactly. And we are talking about peer-reviewed papers from across the entire ideological spectrum.
Which is the aha moment of this whole study. The consensus Habermas found is what Geisler and Turek use as their foundation. Because you might assume that skeptical scholars and conservative theologians would disagree on literally every single aspect of the narrative.
I mean, you'd think so.
Right, but the research indicates that virtually all of these scholars, from the ultra-liberal critics to the most conservative defenders, they actually agree on a core set of first-century historical facts. There is a baseline of events that is largely undisputed in the academic community, regardless of what the scholar personally believes about the supernatural.
Let's walk through that baseline, because the authors list these agreed-upon facts, and they really do set the stage for everything that follows. First, there's overwhelming academic agreement that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion.
Second, he was buried, most likely in a private tomb.
Third, immediately following his execution, his disciples were just completely despondent, they were terrified, they scattered, and they had lost all hope that he was the Messiah.
Then we arrive at the real historical pivot points. The fourth widely agreed upon fact is that the tomb was found empty very soon after his interment.
And fifth, the disciples had experiences that they genuinely, sincerely believed were actual appearances of the risen Jesus.
Yes. And sixth, as a direct result of those experiences, their lives were totally transformed. I mean, they went from hiding in a room in absolute fear to boldly proclaiming this message, even to the point where they were willing to endure torture and martyrdom for that belief.
The authors also highlight the sudden conversions of 2 major, well-documented skeptics of the early Christian movement. You have James, who was Jesus' own brother, and historical records indicate he was deeply skeptical of Jesus during his lifetime.
Right, and then you have Saul of Tarsus, later known as Paul, who was actively imprisoning and persecuting the early Christians.
Yeah, both of these men suddenly and radically changed their lives based on what they claimed were personal encounters with the resurrected Jesus.
So Geisler and Turek use this baseline to set up a very specific logical framework. They argue that when you look at how early the documents were written, the sheer volume of early eyewitness corroboration, and this is key, the embarrassing details the writers included about themselves.
Like fleeing in terror or doubting.
Exactly. You have to rule out a few initial possibilities. They argue the New Testament cannot simply be a legend that developed over centuries, nor can it be a deliberate lie or a massive embellishment.
So if we accept their premise that we can rule out legend, lie, and embellishment, the natural next question you have to ask is, well, could they have simply been mistaken?
Right.
Geisler and Turek argued that the skeptic is left with only one logical avenue at that point. The disciples must have been deceived. They weren't lying, but they were fundamentally wrong about what they thought they saw.
Which brings us to the second part of our deep dive, the alternative theories. If they were deceived, how exactly did it happen?
The authors tackle these alternative theories head-on, started with what is commonly called the hallucination theory. This is the idea that the disciples, just overcome by profound grief and trauma, simply hallucinated the risen Jesus.
And honestly, I can see why someone might lean toward that. Grief does strange things to the human mind.
For sure. But Geisler and Turek use a really relatable analogy to counter this. They point out that hallucinations are highly individualized, much like dreams. Think about the last time you had a vivid dream. You don't wake up in the morning, look at your partner, and say, wow, wasn't that a great dream we both just shared?
Yeah, groups of people do not hallucinate the exact same thing at the exact same time. It is an individual psychological phenomenon, not a collective projection. To back this up, the authors point to Table 12.1 in their text, which provides a detailed breakdown of the recorded appearances.
And what does that table show?
Well, according to the historical data they present, Jesus didn't just appear once in a dimly lit room to a single grieving person. He reportedly appeared 12 separate times over a 40-day period.
Wow.
He appeared to individuals, sure, but also to groups. In one recorded instance, he appeared to up to 500 people at the exact same time.
And these weren't just fleeting ghost-like visions either. The text points out that on 6 of those 12 recorded occasions, he was physically touched or he ate real food with them. I mean, you cannot share a meal of baked fish with a hallucination.
No, you can't. Furthermore, Geisler and Turek note that the hallucination theory suffers from a massive geographical problem. It completely fails to explain the empty tomb.
Oh, right.
If the disciples were just hallucinating while walking around Jerusalem, the authorities could have easily just gone to the tomb, rolled away the stone, and paraded the corpse through the streets to permanently shut the movement down.
Yeah, that's a glaring issue. And that naturally gives rise to the next theory skeptics often propose, which is the wrong tomb theory. The premise here is that the grieving women and the disoriented disciples simply went to the wrong grave in the early morning light, found it empty, panicked, and assumed a resurrection.
Which, honestly, considering I frequently lose my car in the grocery store parking lot, going to the wrong grave doesn't sound entirely implausible at first glance.
Right. But the authors counter this by digging into the specific historical context. The tomb in question wasn't some unmarked plot in a crowded public graveyard. It belonged to a man named Joseph of Arimathea.
And he wasn't just a random citizen. He was a prominent, wealthy member of the Jewish Sanhedrin.
And for those who might not know, the Sanhedrin was essentially the supreme religious and political court of the Jewish people at that time. He was a highly public figure.
Precisely. Because of his status, the location of his private family tomb would have been well known. And furthermore, the Roman authorities had placed a guard detail specifically at that location. For the wrong tomb theory to hold any water, the text argues it would require a massive, inexplicable collective amnesia.
Right, you'd have to believe that the disciples, the women, the Jewish leaders, and the Roman authorities all simultaneously forgot where this highly prominent tomb was located.
Exactly. And again, if the disciples were mourning at the wrong tomb, the authorities would have simply marched them over to the right one to disprove the claim.
Let's move on to a theory that often feels a bit more physically grounded, the swoon theory. Sometimes it's called the apparent death theory. This is the idea that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. The hypothesis is that he merely passed out or swooned from the pain and blood loss, and then later revived in the cool dampness of the tomb.
And Geisler and Turek rely heavily on brutal forensic and historical details to dismantle this specific theory. They emphasize that Roman executioners were not amateurs. They were highly trained professionals whose own lives depended on ensuring their victims were deceased.
Yeah, they didn't mess around.
Not at all. The text references concrete archaeological evidence, such as a 1968 discovery in Jerusalem. Archaeologists found a first-century crucifixion victim's heel bone with a 7-inch iron nail still driven through it. It verifies the extreme mechanics of the execution process. They also cite the Roman author Quintilian, who documented the standard practice of thrusting a spear into a crucified victim's vital organs to ensure death.
The authors even bring modern medicine into the argument. They cite a detailed March 1986 report published in the Journal of the American Medical Association.
Oh, the JMA report.
Yeah, a Mayo Clinic pathologist and a team of doctors reviewed all the historical and medical evidence surrounding the execution methods of the first century. And they concluded that the spear wound to the side, as described in the ancient accounts, would have forcefully perforated the right lung, the pericardium, which is the tough sac surrounding the heart muscle and the heart itself. Geisler and Turek used this medical analysis to argue that, anatomically speaking, survival was an absolute impossibility.
But the authors actually take it a step further. They argue that even if you completely suspend your disbelief and entertain the idea that he somehow survived an execution designed to be 100% fatal, you run into a wall of logical absurdity regarding what would have to happen next.
Right. Just think about the physical state he would be in. According to the text, you'd have to believe that a bleeding, mutilated man who had been entombed in total darkness without food, water, or medical care for 76 hours and securely wrapped in 75 pounds of spice-laden linens somehow wakes up.
Yeah.
Then he manages to unwrap himself, somehow pushes aside a 2-ton stone from the inside of the cave, overpowers a squad of elite, heavily armed Roman guards, and then walks miles on pierced feet to find his disciples.
It's a stretch, and the psychological component is even more problematic. If a man in that horrific near-death condition stumbled into the room where the disciples were hiding, they wouldn't worship him as the glorious, triumphant conqueror of death.
As the text mildly jokes, they would call a doctor.
Right. A desperate, crippled survivor needing immediate medical attention does not spark a global movement based on the concept of a glorified, resurrected body. It simply doesn't fit the psychology of the disciples' sudden transformation into fearless martyrs.
So if he didn't wake up and walk out under his own power, the logical pivot for skeptic is that someone else must have taken him out. That brings us to the stolen body theory. Did the disciples simply steal the body in the dead of night to fake the resurrection and keep their movement alive?
The primary counter-argument the authors raise here revolves around human psychology and motive. You really have to ask yourself, why? Why would a group of terrified, scattered individuals who had just watched their leader be brutally executed suddenly orchestrate a daring heist against armed Roman guards?
It makes no psychological sense. You have to consider the outcome of this supposed heist. By claiming Jesus was resurrected, these disciples gained absolutely zero worldly wealth, power, or status. Instead, they were beaten, tortured, imprisoned, and eventually murdered.
And Geisler and Turek make a vital distinction here. People might willingly die for a lie they genuinely think is the truth. But human history shows that people do not willingly subject themselves to torture and death for a lie they know they personally invented, especially when there is no tangible payoff.
Right. To support the implausibility of the grave robbing theory, the text introduces a fascinating piece of archaeological evidence, the Nazareth inscription.
Yes, this is a marble slab discovered in Nazareth, generally dated to the reign of Emperor Tiberius or Claudius. The inscription is essentially an imperial edict that elevates the crime of grave robbing from a simple civil fine to a capital offense punishable by death.
The death penalty just for moving a body, that seems like a massive overreaction by the Roman Empire.
It does, unless it was a targeted response. Geisler and Turek suggest this severe edict could be a direct Roman reaction to the explosive events in Jerusalem. The historical record shows that the early Jewish authorities were actively claiming the disciples stole the body.
Okay.
But the authors point out a massive logical concession embedded in that accusation. By officially claiming that the body was stolen, the enemies of early Christianity were inherently admitting that the tomb was, in fact, empty.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. You don't need to concoct a complex cover story about a grave robbery if the corpse is still peacefully resting in the tomb.
That is a fascinating legal deduction. Now, the text also addresses a completely different perspective that comes up in Islamic tradition, often referred to as the substitute theory. The Quran states that Jesus was not actually crucified, but rather someone else was put on the cross in his place, making it only appear to the crowds as though he died.
And Geisler and Turek critique this theory primarily by focusing on the timeline and the availability of evidence. They emphasize that this specific claim originated more than 600 years after the events in Jerusalem took place. Crucially, there are absolutely zero first-century documents or contemporary eyewitness accounts that support the idea of a substitute.
The authors also point out the sheer logistical improbability of the deception. I mean, to accept the substitute theory, you have to believe in an unprecedented case of mistaken identity. You have to believe that Jesus' own mother Mary, his closest disciples who stood near the cross, the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, and the professional executioners all somehow failed to recognize that the man screaming in agony was a complete stranger.
It's hard to fathom.
To use an analogy drawn from their logic, it would be like suggesting Abraham Lincoln wasn't the man assassinated at Ford's Theater, and that his wife sitting right next to him in the box just happened to be mistaken about his identity.
Right. The final major theory the text evaluates from the skeptic's toolkit is the copied pagan myth theory. If you've spent any time on the internet, you've likely seen documentaries claiming that the New Testament writers simply plagiarized older ancient myths about dying and rising gods, such as the Egyptian god Osiris or the Greek god Dionysus.
Geisler and Turek push back on this copycat narrative on several fronts. First, they lean on the literary expertise of C.S. Lewis. Before he wrote popular fiction, Lewis was a brilliant, world-renowned literary critic and a scholar of ancient mythology at Oxford.
Yes, he knew his stuff.
He analyzed the texts and essentially concluded that the Gospels simply do not read like ancient myths. Myths are vague, they're ethereal, and they're set in a distant once upon a time. The Gospels, conversely, read like ancient historical biographies. They are grounded in very specific geographic locations, precise dates, and feature heavily corroborated historical figures like Pilate and Herod.
And beyond the literary style, the authors point out a massive flaw in the historical timeline of the copycat theory. According to their research, the very first real historical parallel of a dying and rising god doesn't actually appear in the historical record until roughly AD 150.
Which is way later.
That is more than 100 years after the Christian movement began. Geisler and Turek argue that if any copying was happening in antiquity, the later pagan mythologies were likely absorbing elements of the rapidly spreading Christian narrative, not the other way around.
Plus, the details of these myths rarely align with the resurrection narrative. Take Osiris, for example. The text notes that the myth of Osiris involves his body being chopped into 14 pieces and scattered across Egypt by his brother.
Right. He isn't bodily resurrected to walk the earth. He becomes the lord of the underworld. It is a completely different theological framework entirely.
So, having systematically challenged all of these alternative theories, Geisler and Turek move into the third major section of their argument, the philosophy of miracles and the burden of proof. They pose a very pointed challenge to the reader. They note that there is a complete absence of contemporary evidence for any of these alternatives.
Yeah, none.
There is no first-century document that says it was a hallucination or a swoon or a stolen body. So if the alternative theories lack contemporary evidence and the agreed-upon historical facts point toward an empty tomb and post-death appearances, why do so many highly educated modern scholars still doubt the resurrection? Their answer boils down to philosophical bias. To illustrate this, the authors highlight a famous academic debate between Christian philosopher William Lane Craig and skeptical scholar John Dominic Crossan. Crossan's main argument was that the disciples' profound faith is what ultimately created the resurrection story. They wanted to believe he was still with them so badly that their minds essentially invented the appearances.
But Craig countered that Crossan had the cause and effect entirely backwards. The historical record shows the disciples were terrified cowards in hiding. It was the physical appearances of the risen Jesus that generated their newfound faith, not their pre-existing faith that manifested the appearances. But the most revealing moment of this debate, according to the text, was a deeply candid admission Crossan made regarding his own worldview.
Yes, this part is incredibly telling. Crossan essentially admitted that he operates with a strict, immovable theological presupposition against the supernatural. He told a story about his own backyard. He said that if he woke up tomorrow morning and found that every single tree in his yard had mysteriously moved 5 feet overnight, he still would not presume a miracle had occurred.
Wow.
He would automatically assume there was a natural scientific explanation that he simply didn't understand yet.
And Geisler and Turek use Crossan's admission to argue that many skeptical scholars approach history with a rigid anti-supernatural bias. Because they philosophically rule out the very possibility of miracles before they even look at a single piece of evidence, they artificially force themselves to accept purely naturalistic explanations.
Right.
They are compelled to adopt the swoon theory or the hallucination theory or the stolen body theory, even when the historical and logical flaws in those theories are overwhelming.
But Geisler and Turek argue that context is everything when evaluating an event. They take Crossan's moving trees analogy and flip it to prove their point. They argue that, sure, if trees just randomly move for no reason, you should look for a natural explanation. But what if you change the context?
Right, context matters.
What if a prophet boldly predicted 200 years ago that those exact trees would move on a highly specific date, and then a man shows up in your town, claims to be the Son of God, performs 30 other historically verified miracles, and says, "Watch the trees." Then the trees actually move, 500 people witness it happen, and those witnesses are willing to be executed to defend what they saw.
In that specific, highly corroborated context, the authors argue it is actually far more logical to deduce a supernatural cause than to desperately search for a natural one. Their text operates on the premise that we live in a theistic universe. And for clarity, a theistic universe is simply a universe where a creator exists and possesses the capacity to intervene in the natural order.
Yeah.
And if a theistic universe is possible, then miracles are not only possible, but in the specific context of Jesus' life and ancient prophecies, they were explicitly predicted.
This philosophical discussion leads directly into their critique of a phrase you hear all the time. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Geisler and Turek argue this popular skeptical demand is actually a logical double standard designed to set an impossibly high bar. If extraordinary evidence means you need a miracle to prove a miracle, you end up in an endless logical loop.
Right.
If it means the event must be repeatable in a laboratory setting under observation, well, history inherently isn't repeatable. We can't put the Battle of Waterloo in a test tube.
To highlight this double standard, the authors make a highly compelling comparison to Alexander the Great. In academic circles and the general public, we consider the life and conquests of Alexander the Great to be absolutely settled history. He conquered the known world, built a massive empire, and altered global politics. Yet, the text points out a startling fact. Virtually everything we know about the details of Alexander's life comes from historical sources written 300 to 500 years after his death.
Wait, let that sink in for a moment. 3 to 5 centuries later. Yet no credible historian doubts that he existed or accomplished those massive feats.
Geisler and Turek are asking the reader to evaluate the weight of the evidence fairly. The New Testament documents, by contrast, date to within 1 or 2 generations of the actual events. They contain multiple overlapping eyewitness accounts and are corroborated by external archaeological finds and hostile secular sources. The authors are forcefully asking, why do we accept the history of Alexander the Great based on incredibly late sources without a second thought, yet demand an impossibly high, scientifically repeatable standard of proof for the historical events surrounding the life of Jesus?
So as we begin to wrap up this deep dive, let's summarize the overarching thesis Geisler and Turek are presenting. They conclude that when you impartially evaluate the universally agreed-upon historical baseline, and you systematically examine the fatal logical and historical flaws in every alternative naturalistic theory, it actually requires more faith to disbelieve the resurrection than it does to simply follow the evidence where it naturally leads.
And to cap off their extensive argument, the authors reference a famous essay entitled One Solitary Life. It serves as a powerful reflection on the completely unparalleled, outsized impact of this one specific historical figure. The excerpt detailed in the text points out that Jesus was a peasant carpenter born in an obscure, impoverished village in the Middle East. He never wrote a book, he never held any political office, he never owned property, and he never amassed or led an army. He possessed absolutely none of the credentials or resources we historically associate with global greatness, and his public career ended with him being executed as a state criminal at the age of 33.
And yet, as the text beautifully paraphrases, 20 centuries have come and gone, and all the armies that ever marched, all the navies that ever sailed, all the parliaments that ever sat, and all the kings that ever reigned put together have not affected the life of humanity on this earth as powerfully as that one solitary life. Geisler and Turek argue that this monumental, world-altering level of historical impact is completely inexplicable if he was merely a charismatic teacher who simply died and rotted in a forgotten tomb.
It is undeniably a compelling and emotionally resonant capstone to their rigorous historical argument. But to reiterate the stance we established at the beginning of our deep dive, our objective today has simply been to unpack the historical framework, the specific data points, and the logical deductions exactly as they are presented by Geisler and Turek.
Right, keeping it impartial.
The authors have meticulously laid out their case for why they believe the historical evidence firmly points to the resurrection. Now, having heard their arguments and their counter-arguments to the skeptics, it is entirely up to you to weigh the validity of that evidence for yourself.
We act as the guides to bring the sources to light. You are the detective who gets to decide what to do with the clues.
And as you mull over the complex historical and philosophical frameworks we have explored today, I want to leave you with one final thought to explore on your own. Think back to that comparison the authors made regarding Alexander the Great. Think about all the historical figures, ancient empires, and massive events from antiquity that you accept as absolute, unquestioned fact right now. If we applied the exact same extreme skepticism and the exact same rigorous demand for extraordinary, scientifically repeatable evidence to every single ancient event, how many of our history books would suddenly be left completely blank?
That is definitely a perspective-shifting question to chew on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the historical arguments of Geisler and Turek. Keep questioning the evidence, keep exploring the sources, and we will see you next time.